It began not with music or light, but with a sentence spoken too softly to be challenged and too loudly to be ignored, a sentence that broke a young woman standing in the space of a breath. She heard it before she understood it, felt it before she could defend herself, and in that instant the careful life she had built from obedience and patience tilted toward disgrace. No name was spoken, yet the meaning was unmistakable, and she learned, as many before her had learned, how swiftly honor could be questioned and how slowly it could be restored. She was known to society as Miss Eleanor Hartwell, though few troubled themselves to know her beyond that. To her family she was duty made flesh, raised to listen, trained to yield, instructed from childhood that happiness was a privilege granted only after responsibility had been satisfied. Her engagement to the Duke of Ashcombe had been settled with quiet approval, not as a romance but as a solution, a union meant to secure futures and calm anxieties. Eleanor accepted it without protest, believing that respect, carefully tended, might one day grow into affection. The Duke himself remained a distant certainty in her mind, a man of reputation rather than memory. He was said to be measured in speech, unyielding in principle, and exacting in matters of honor. She had met him only a handful of times, each encounter governed by decorum so strict it left little room for familiarity. Yet she trusted his integrity more than she trusted her own feelings, and that trust anchored her against doubts she dared not voice. The sentence that wounded her did not come from an enemy, but from a voice polished by manners and sharpened by amusement. It suggested, with delicate cruelty, that Eleanor's conduct had invited attention where restraint should have prevailed. The remark fluttered through the gathering like a rumor with wings, gathering meaning as it moved, until it returned to her altered and enlarged. She did nothing to correct it. Silence, she had been taught, was often safer than defense. What unsettled her most was not the insinuation itself, but the sudden awareness that she was being observed differently. Courtesy did not vanish, it tightened. Politeness became a test she was expected to fail. She sensed curiosity where there had once been indifference, and judgment where there had once been calm. In that shifting atmosphere, she felt her engagement transform from protection into burden, its absence from the evening's discourse noted with unkind precision. The prince noticed her because others did not expect him to. He was newly returned to court, accustomed to admiration yet wary of its cost, trained to hear what was spoken beneath civility. When the careless sentence reached him, he recognized its weight at once. He did not look for spectacle or scandal, only for the person it harmed, and found Eleanor bearing the injury with a composure that was neither proud nor pleading. It was that restraint, rather than beauty or novelty, that drew his attention and held it. He approached her with the caution of a man who understood the danger of notice. His words were formal, chosen to offer respect without presumption, yet they carried an unmistakable gentleness. Eleanor answered him as she answered all challenges, with measured clarity and no complaint. In that brief exchange each recognized in the other a shared understanding of limits imposed and roles assigned, and something unspoken passed between them, quiet and perilous. Others observed the interaction and misread it. To some it confirmed suspicion, to others it promised diversion. Eleanor felt the balance of her life shift again, not because of what had occurred, but because of what might be imagined. The prince, aware of the same danger, withdrew sooner than politeness required, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than speech. As the evening progressed, the absence of the Duke grew louder. Eleanor knew he was detained by matters of state, that his delay was reasonable and unavoidable, yet reason offered little comfort when weighed against rumor. She wondered, not for the first time, whether his faith in her would withstand the distortions of distance and delay. She wondered, too, whether she deserved such faith when even her stillness could be twisted into accusation. The prince listened as speculation multiplied, his expression carefully neutral. He understood, with a clarity sharpened by rank, how swiftly power could wound when guided by idle amusement. He also understood that his own interest, however restrained, could deepen the harm already done. In that knowledge lay the first true conflict of the night, though no voice named it, whether silence would preserve honor, or whether silence itself had become a form of consent. Eleanor felt the strain of holding herself unchanged while the world shifted around her. She longed, not for rescue but for recognition of her truth, a truth composed of patience, loyalty, and fear. When she finally withdrew from the gathering, it was with the careful grace expected of her, yet inside she carried a fracture that would not easily mend. Somewhere beyond her hearing, a message was being prepared for the Duke, shaped by rumor and softened by courtesy, its meaning altered by every mouth it passed through. Eleanor did not know what words would reach him, only that they would arrive before she could speak for herself. In that uncertainty lay the quiet tragedy of her position, and the first shadow cast over a bond that had not yet learned how to endure suspicion. She returned home resolved to wait, because waiting was the only agency permitted to her. Yet resolve did not still the unease that settled into her thoughts, nor did it quiet the sense that something irreversible had begun. The prince, elsewhere, reached the same conclusion from another angle, realizing that admiration carried consequence. Between restraint and desire, between rumor and honor, the night had already chosen its path, and none could yet foresee. It continued with a gift that was never meant to be a gift, and therefore wounded more deeply than any deliberate insult. News of it reached Eleanor before the object itself, framed as rumor, sharpened by delight, and carried with the same breathless urgency as scandal. She understood at once that intention no longer mattered. Meaning had already been assigned. Whatever had been offered, whatever courtesy had guided it, society would shape it into proof. Thus the night's whisper matured into daylight certainty, and her private restraint was recast as silent encouragement by those eager to believe. The narrative hardened. Within days the token arrived not to her hand, but to her reputation, its passage traced through smiles and raised brows. It was a modest offering, chosen with care, yet modesty did not survive translation. Those who repeated its existence enlarged it, embroidered motives upon it, and spoke the prince's name with a knowing cadence. Eleanor neither accepted nor rejected what she had never received. She held herself apart, fearing that any acknowledgment would bind her to a story she did not author, and that denial would only provoke sharper invention. Silence became her frail shield against gathering judgment everywhere. The prince, meanwhile, found himself confronted by the unintended consequence of courtesy. He had selected the token with deliberation, believing formality a safe vessel for admiration disciplined into respect. When he learned how it had been received, a quiet remorse settled upon him, heavier than embarrassment. He recognized the familiar cruelty of courts, where intention dissolved beneath appetite. Yet withdrawal now appeared as abandonment. To correct the misunderstanding publicly would magnify it, and to remain silent risked confirming it. For the first time, restraint felt less like virtue and more like complicity in the unfolding tragedy he scarcely anticipated before. The Duke of Ashcombe returned to London under a sky indifferent to reputation, carrying with him the weight of expectation and the discipline of self-command. He did not seek gossip, yet gossip found him, softened by politeness and delivered as concern. Each account differed, yet all pointed toward the same implication. He listened without interruption, storing each inconsistency with care. The Duke believed in order, in cause preceding effect, and he struggled now with a narrative that defied both. Eleanor's silence troubled him less than the eagerness of others to speak for her with confidence. He distrusted deeply and privately. Eleanor learned of the Duke's return through a letter written in a hand not his own, its tone respectful yet cautious. It offered no accusation, but neither did it offer reassurance. She read it repeatedly, searching for warmth between formal phrases and finding only space. Her resolve to wait hardened into something more painful, the fear that patience might be mistaken for indifference. She considered writing, then stopped, knowing that explanation, once demanded, rarely remained unpunished. Thus she prepared herself for judgment delivered without intimacy, and for a conversation shaped by absence long deferred yet inevitable by others' design alone. The court delighted in the interval, that cruel space between rumor and response. Invitations multiplied, each a polite demand for performance. Eleanor attended only those she could not refuse, her composure intact yet strained, her presence interpreted as defiance by some and surrender by others. The prince watched from a careful distance, aware that his gaze itself could be counted as provocation. He began to understand how power could injure without touch, how attention could bruise. In that realization, admiration gave way to responsibility, a burden heavier than desire. It altered his future choices irrevocably, though consequences remained unseen yet. When the Duke finally appeared at court, formality thickened the air. He greeted Eleanor with courtesy unmarred by warmth or coldness, a neutrality more unnerving than anger. Their exchange lasted seconds, yet it redefined her understanding of him. He was not indifferent, he was controlled. Later in private he asked nothing, observing instead as if weighing silence itself. Eleanor felt the urge to confess everything and resisted it, sensing that confession, too, could be interpreted as defense. Between them stretched an unspoken question neither dared to phrase, its weight pressing upon their restraint with accumulating and dangerous force quietly now. The prince sought counsel from no one, for counsel would require disclosure. Instead, he observed the duke with growing respect, recognizing a man who guarded honor as carefully as territory. In their proximity lay the seed of conflict, though neither had yet claimed it. The prince understood that any step forward would demand another man's loss, and the knowledge steadied him. Desire, once unnamed, now demanded reckoning. He resolved to act neither hastily nor invisibly, knowing that invisibility had already proven harmful. The decision waited, heavy and unavoidable, as days narrowed toward confrontation with consequences still unrevealed to all involved. Eleanor sensed the tightening circle, though no one named it. Her name appeared in conversation like a reference, not a presence, and she felt herself reduced to an idea others debated. Yet within that reduction something hardened. She recognized that obedience had not spared her pain, and silence had not preserved peace. This recognition did not make her reckless, but it made her attentive. She began to consider how truth might be spoken without spectacle, and whether dignity could be asserted without defiance. The thought unsettled her, quietly preparing her for change she could neither predict nor prevent any longer. Thus the tragedy deepened, not through betrayal, but through restraint tested beyond its design. Each of them stood at the edge of action, aware that the next choice would alter not only reputation but conscience. Messages waited unsent. Words rehearsed themselves into silence. Somewhere between rumor and resolution, a reckoning gathered force. Eleanor understood that the duke would soon ask his question, and the prince understood that he would soon answer his own. The court, impatient, leaned closer. What followed would not remain contained, nor would it spare them from the cost of honor tested publicly by unforgiving society itself. It broke at last not with accusation, but with a pause so long it demanded speech, a pause that exposed how thin patience had grown and how heavy silence had become. Eleanor felt it before it was named, that moment when waiting ceased to be obedience and became avoidance, and she understood that whatever came next would reshape the meaning of every restraint she had practiced. Tragedy, she realized, did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it entered as an invitation to finally speak. The duke asked for privacy without emphasis, and the request itself carried more weight than any command. Eleanor agreed at once, knowing refusal would be interpreted as evasion, yet acceptance felt equally perilous. Between them stood weeks of rumor and measured distance, and beneath that distance lay a mutual fear of misjudgment. He did not accuse her, and that mercy unsettled her more than anger would have done. He waited, and in that waiting offered her the burden of truth. She began with what could not be misunderstood, her loyalty. She spoke of the engagement as a promise she had honored even when its protection failed her, and of silence chosen not to conceal guilt but to prevent further distortion. Her words were careful, yet they carried strain, the strain of a woman long practiced in moderation now testing its limits. She did not name the prince at first, not out of fear, but because she refused to frame herself as a subject of rivalry. She spoke instead of restraint mistaken for invitation. The duke listened without interruption, his stillness exacting and complete. When she finally named the prince, she did so without embellishment, acknowledging the courtesy that had been misread and the discomfort it caused her. She confessed not attachment but confusion, not desire but dismay. The honesty cost her, for she sensed how easily even sincerity could be twisted, yet she continued, believing that incomplete truth would serve no one. In that decision lay her first true act of courage, quiet yet irrevocable. He responded not with judgment, but with a question shaped by humility rather than authority. He asked whether she wished to withdraw from the engagement. The simplicity of it startled her, and she understood that he was offering escape without humiliation. She answered without hesitation. Her resolve surprised even herself, for it rose not from obligation, but from respect freely chosen. In that moment, the duke saw not a burden of alliance, but a partner capable of choice, and something in his expression shifted, unseen yet deeply felt. Elsewhere, the prince confronted his own reckoning. He requested a private audience with the duke, prepared to accept rebuke or dismissal, knowing that intention no longer shielded him from consequence. He spoke plainly, acknowledging admiration while denying pursuit, and naming restraint not as virtue but as necessity. He did not plead innocence, he claimed responsibility. In doing so, he relinquished the comfort of ambiguity and accepted the cost of clarity. The duke received this confession with measured regard, recognizing honor in its timing and gravity. Between the two men passed an understanding forged not in competition, but in mutual refusal to exploit uncertainty. The prince affirmed that he would withdraw entirely, not as sacrifice but as correction, and that he would speak publicly if required. The Duke declined spectacle, choosing resolution over display. Their exchange ended without agreement, yet with respect, a rare outcome in a court that thrived on imbalance. Each departed altered, the conflict narrowed but not dissolved, awaiting its final articulation before others less inclined to mercy. Eleanor felt the shift before it was announced, a loosening in the air that suggested decisions had been made beyond her hearing. She sensed the Duke's regard deepen into something steadier, less guarded, and that awareness brought both comfort and fear. To be seen clearly was no small risk. She wondered whether society would permit such clarity, or whether it would demand a performance instead. Her role, long defined by compliance, seemed suddenly inadequate to the gravity of what was unfolding. She reflected on how easily lives were shaped by what was left unsaid, and how often endurance was mistaken for agreement. The past weeks had taught her that virtue, when isolated, could become invisible, and that silence, when prolonged, invited others to speak with authority they had not earned. Yet she also learned that truth did not require volume to be effective, only timing and resolve. In choosing to speak when it mattered, she had reclaimed a measure of agency without abandoning grace. Whatever judgment awaited her beyond those walls would meet a woman no longer defined solely by compliance. That knowledge steadied her breathing and clarified her purpose, not as rebellion, but as fidelity to her own conscience, newly awakened and quietly unyielding. It was a strength she would need, for patience alone could not protect what honor now required courage to defend openly together. As the prince prepared to leave London on official business, he requested one final message be conveyed, not to Eleanor directly but to the court at large. He would clarify, he said, without naming her, without diminishing the Duke. The choice remained with the Duke whether to allow it. That decision, still pending, hovered over them all, its outcome poised to redeem or entrench every rumor spoken thus far. Eleanor waited, aware that the truth, once released, could not be recalled, and that honor, once defended, might finally demand its due in the open. It erupted as a public silence, heavier than accusation, when the prince chose to speak and the court discovered that restraint could be louder than scandal. Tragedy lingered in the knowledge that words, once offered in defense, could wound as surely as rumor if shaped without care. The assembly waited, not for spectacle, but for permission to believe something better than what it had rehearsed. In that waiting, reputations balanced on breath, and dignity stood exposed to judgment it could neither command nor evade. The prince began without apology and without naming desire. He acknowledged confusion, accepted responsibility for misunderstanding, and insisted upon limits that should have governed all conduct. He spoke of respect as obligation rather than preference, and of withdrawal as correction rather than sacrifice. His tone refused drama, and that refusal unsettled an audience accustomed to performance. By declining to elevate himself, he denied the court its favorite currency. The absence of flourish forced listeners to reckon with the truth as he framed it. That attention, when misread, demanded repair, not pursuit. Murmurs followed, yet they lacked conviction. The prince had offered no contest, no rival claim to admire. In doing so, he returned the focus to the engagement that had been questioned, and by implication to the Duke whose silence had been interpreted as weakness. The Duke rose not to counter rumor, but to complete the prince's restraint with his own. He did not praise Eleanor publicly. He affirmed the engagement as a matter of honor freely entered and firmly held. The simplicity of his words carried authority precisely because they avoided defense. Eleanor listened, aware that her name hovered unspoken, protected and constrained by the choices of men acting within codes she had long obeyed. She felt gratitude and unease in equal measure. To be spared scrutiny was relief, to be spoken for was familiar discomfort. Yet she recognized the care embedded in their restraint, and she accepted that this moment was not hers to command. Dignity, she understood, sometimes required trust in another's timing, even when patience had already cost her dearly. The court absorbed the exchange and recalibrated its posture. Those who had traded on ambiguity found themselves deprived of it. The absence of accusation starved their appetite. Still, the damage did not vanish. Silence could be interpreted anew, and restraint could be recast as strategy by those invested in suspicion. The prince's words settled matters formally, yet informally they ignited a new tension, the need for closure beyond correction, a declaration not of innocence but of intention. After the assembly dispersed, the Duke sought Eleanor not to congratulate or console, but to speak plainly. He did not claim triumph. He acknowledged the cost of the past weeks and admitted his failure to shield her sooner. His candor surprised her more than any public defense could have done. He spoke of partnership as responsibility shared, not protection bestowed. In that shift, Eleanor felt the engagement transform, not into romance, but into something steadier and more demanding: mutual accountability. She answered him with clarity earned through trial. She spoke of the loneliness of silence and the burden of being presumed rather than known. She affirmed her choice again, not because it was safe but because it was honest. The Duke listened with attention unclouded by pride, and when he responded, it was to ask how he might serve the bond they were shaping, not how he might command it. The question altered the balance between them, replacing arrangement with consent renewed. Yet resolution required more than private accord. The prince's offer to clarify publicly remained unresolved, an instrument capable of settling lingering doubt or stirring renewed scrutiny. The Duke weighed the cost of allowing it. Public statements hardened truth into record, leaving no room for misinterpretation, but also no refuge from error. To permit the prince to speak again risked reopening wounds. To refuse risked allowing rumor to survive in the shadows. Eleanor understood the weight of the choice and did not attempt to sway it, trusting the judgment she had learned to respect. The prince waited, prepared to depart regardless of outcome. He understood that honor demanded completion, not recognition. His willingness to accept obscurity marked the final proof of his restraint. He did not seek Eleanor's gratitude, nor the court's absolution. He sought alignment between action and consequence, believing that such alignment, once achieved, could restore order without spectacle. In that belief, he accepted the possibility that his name would fade from the story, and he found the acceptance bracing rather than bitter. The Duke chose containment over declaration. He thanked the prince and declined further address, asserting that the matter was settled by conduct already displayed. The decision disappointed some and relieved others, but it affirmed a principle the Duke valued: that honor need not explain itself endlessly to be real. Eleanor felt the relief of finality tempered by uncertainty. Closure had been chosen, yet closure without proclamation left space where doubt might persist. She resolved to inhabit that space with steadiness rather than fear. As arrangements advanced, Eleanor sensed the court adjusting to a new equilibrium. Curiosity softened into observation, judgment retreated into politeness. The engagement, once burdened by rumor, regained its formal gravity. Still, Eleanor recognized that restoration was not erasure. The experience had altered her understanding of safety and voice. She no longer mistook endurance for protection, nor silence for strength. The shift within her was subtle but permanent, preparing her for the public role she would soon assume. The section closed not with celebration, but with a withheld breath. On the eve of the prince's departure, a sealed note arrived for the Duke, requesting a final audience before dawn, its contents unknown. Eleanor learned of it indirectly and felt the old unease return, sharpened by anticipation. Resolution had been claimed, yet the past insisted upon one last reckoning. What would be said in that meeting could confirm peace or expose a fracture still hidden, awaiting an answer. It ended where it might have broken, in a moment balanced between farewell and reckoning, when the final choice refused spectacle and demanded resolve. Tragedy lingered not as threat, but as memory, reminding each of them how narrowly dignity had been preserved. The dawn meeting was brief, unrecorded, and decisive. When the Duke emerged, there was no sign of victory or loss upon his face, only the stillness of a man who had concluded a matter without surrendering himself to it. The prince departed before the city fully stirred, his role finished by restraint rather than conquest. He carried no bitterness, only the clarity that sometimes the highest assertion of feeling was its deliberate absence. In leaving quietly, he sealed his part in the narrative as one of correction rather than claim. The court would remember him with admiration softened by distance, and Eleanor would remember him as a lesson learned at cost but without resentment. His absence created space, and in that space resolution could finally take form. For Eleanor, the days that followed were marked by an unfamiliar calm. The strain of vigilance eased, replaced by the weight of approaching permanence. The engagement, once a concept shaped by obligation, now carried texture and intention. She and the Duke spoke more freely, not with ease born of intimacy, but with trust forged through trial. They discussed practicalities, expectations, and the future they would inhabit together, each conversation reinforcing the understanding that marriage would not erase individuality, but demand mutual regard. The Duke revealed himself gradually, not through declarations but through consistency. He listened, remembered, and adjusted, small gestures that signaled partnership rather than authority. Eleanor recognized in him a steadiness that no longer felt distant, but deliberate. She began to imagine contentment not as surrender but as collaboration. The idea surprised her, reshaping her understanding of happiness into something quieter and more durable than passion, yet no less profound. The court observed the transformation with tempered interest. Scandal had exhausted itself, leaving behind a preference for order. Eleanor's composure, once misread, now earned respect. She did not reclaim her reputation through denial, but through presence, appearing unchanged by scrutiny yet subtly strengthened by experience. Her silence was no longer mistaken for absence of will. It had become a chosen reserve, signaling confidence rather than vulnerability. As preparations advanced, Eleanor reflected on how narrowly her life had been redirected. She recognized that the danger had not been desire, but misinterpretation, not attention, but assumption. The experience sharpened her sense of self, teaching her that dignity required participation as well as endurance. She resolved to carry this knowledge into her marriage, not as defense, but as awareness, ensuring that partnership would remain active rather than inherited. The wedding itself was conducted without extravagance, its dignity rooted in restraint rather than display. Vows were spoken with gravity, each word measured and intentional. Eleanor felt no rush of transformation, no sudden clarity, only the steady recognition that she was entering a bond shaped by choice renewed. The Duke's regard met hers without uncertainty, and in that exchange lay the promise of a life governed by mutual respect rather than illusion. Afterward, as they withdrew from public attention, Eleanor sensed the final settling of what had once been unsettled. The past weeks receded into memory, their lessons retained without bitterness. She did not regret the pain endured, recognizing that it had clarified her values and strengthened her resolve. The Duke acknowledged the same, admitting that the ordeal had refined his understanding of partnership. In shared reflection they found alignment, a foundation more reliable than convenience or custom. Yet even in resolution the world did not cease its watchfulness. Eleanor understood that marriage would not shield her from scrutiny, nor would status guarantee peace. What it offered instead was solidarity, a shared front against misjudgment. She felt prepared for that challenge, supported not by possession but by trust. The Duke's presence beside her did not eclipse her voice, it steadied it, allowing her to speak when needed and remain silent by choice. Time advanced, smoothing edges without erasing memory. Eleanor assumed her role with intention, aware that influence could be exercised quietly yet effectively. She carried herself with assurance born of survival, no longer fearing misinterpretation as catastrophe. The Duke's regard remained constant, his respect evident in action rather than affirmation. Together they inhabited a partnership shaped less by romance than by reliability, a form of happiness often overlooked yet deeply sustaining. Still, the narrative did not conclude in perfect closure. As Eleanor settled into her new life, she received a final letter, forwarded without ceremony, written in the prince's hand. It contained no confession, no apology, only a reflection on duty fulfilled and wishes extended for contentment earned. Eleanor read it once, then sealed it away, recognizing that some stories ended not with reconciliation, but with understanding. The past, acknowledged and contained, no longer threatened the present. The story closed not with triumph, but with equilibrium restored. Eleanor stood within a life shaped by choice, not rumor, and the Duke beside her embodied honor proven rather than assumed. The world had tested them and moved on, yet the test had left its mark, refining what remained. In that refinement lay their reward, a happiness quiet enough to endure, and strong enough to face whatever judgments might yet arise, unafraid of whispers that no longer define them.